Peppa Pig, the disappearing parents. One evening, while Peppa and George were having dinner, Mummy and Daddy Pig were unusually quiet. Normally they laughed and told stories, but tonight they just sat there, staring at their plates. "Mummy, are you okay?" Peppa asked. "Yes, sweetie," Mummy Pig replied, but her voice sounded hollow. "Daddy, tell us a joke," George asked, but Daddy Pig only gave him a strange look before looking away. That night was only the beginning. The next morning, Mummy Pig didn't make breakfast. Peppa found her standing by the window in the kitchen, unmoving as though deep in thought. "Mummy, are you looking for something?" Peppa asked. Mummy Pig turned around, but her gaze was empty. "Everything will be fine, sweetie," she said before turning back to the window. That evening, Daddy Pig came home late. When he arrived, he looked strange. His clothes were dirty, and he offered no explanation. "Where were you?" Mummy Pig asked, but Daddy just shrugged and sat at the table. The following night, Peppa and George were awakened by strange noises. They heard Mummy and Daddy talking in the living room, but their voices sounded unnatural, as if someone was imitating them. Peppa crept downstairs and peeked into the living room. Her parents stood motionless, staring at a single point on the wall. Their shadows seemed to move on their own, writhing across the floor. "Mummy? Daddy?" Peppa whispered. Her parents turned to her at the same time, their faces stretched into eerie, unnatural smiles. "Go back to bed, Peppa," they said in unison. The next day, Mummy Pig was gone. Her purse was on the table and her phone lay on the floor. Daddy Pig seemed calm and said, "She just stepped out." "Don't worry." But by nightfall, Daddy Pig had disappeared too, leaving Peppa and George alone in the house. That night, they heard noises again. Peeking into the living room, they saw their parents. But their faces were unrecognizable, black, empty eyes, grotesquely wide smiles, and their skin had turned gray. "You're not our Mummy and Daddy," Peppa screamed, grabbing George's hand. Her parents started moving toward them. Their movements were jerky and unnatural, and strange hissing sounds came from their mouths. "Why are you trying to run?" Daddy Pig said, his voice deep and distorted. "We're just getting started," Mummy Pig added, stretching her arms toward them. Suddenly their shadows grew massive, consuming the entire room. Mummy and Daddy Pig began smashing furniture, their bodies twisting at impossible angles, as if they were no longer human. Peppa and George tried to escape, but their parents blocked the way. "We'll stay a family forever," they said in unison. Peppa Pig. George has changed. One evening, Peppa's family was having dinner together. George looked tired and barely played with his dinosaur, which was unusual for him. "George, are you okay?" Peppa asked. "Yes," he said quietly, but his voice sounded strange, as though it came from far away. "He's probably just tired," Mummy Pig said. That night, Peppa woke up to a strange sound. It was a faint whisper coming from their room. She looked over at George and saw him sitting on his bed, staring at the wall. "George, what are you doing?" she asked. "They're calling me," he whispered without turning his head. The next morning, George was acting even stranger. He didn't want to play, didn't eat breakfast, and refused to answer questions. Peppa noticed that his eyes looked darker and his skin appeared pale. "Mummy, what's wrong with George?" Peppa asked. "He just needs some rest," Mummy Pig replied. But Peppa couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. That night, Peppa heard the whispering again. This time it was louder, and she could make out the words, "Come to us, come to us." She turned to George's bed, but it was empty. His bed was neatly made, but his dinosaur toy lay on the floor, torn to pieces. "George, where are you?" Peppa called out. She crept downstairs and found George in the living room. He was standing in the center of the room, illuminated by the moonlight. Around him, the shadows on the floor seemed to move as if they were alive. George, Peppa called again, her voice trembling. He turned to her, smiling in a way she had never seen before. I'm not George anymore, he said in a low, raspy voice. Peppa tried to run, but the doors to the house were locked. George followed her slowly, his shadow on the walls growing larger and more distorted. She noticed his hands were changing. His fingers had grown long and claw-like, and his eyes were now completely black. You'll change too, Peppa, he whispered, his voice echoing from every corner of the house. Peppa hid in her room and locked the door. But the shadows under the door began to seep into the room like thick, dark smoke. Soon George was outside her door, his voice a soft whisper. Don't be afraid, sister. It doesn't hurt. The door creaked open, and in that moment, Peppa glanced at the mirror. Her reflection was different. Her eyes were now black, and her face twisted into a sinister smile.